HOA Karen steals my electricity for her greenhouse. Hey everyone. This is my first time posting something like this, but after everything that's happened, I need to get it all off my chest. My name isn't important, and I hope you'll understand why I'm keeping a low profile by the end of this. Let's just say I moved out of the city about a year ago, looking for some peace and quiet in a suburban neighborhood under the reign of a homeowners association, HOA. People warned me HOAs could be strict, but I never imagined I'd find myself in the middle of something so bizarre, so hush-hush, that I'd question whether I was living in some kind of suburban noir. I'd spent most of my adult life in a large, bustling city. One of those places that's always moving and doesn't wait for you to catch up. While it was exciting, there came a point when the constant noise, traffic, and frenetic pace started wearing me down. I was craving space, a backyard, maybe a small garden, and the solace of birds chirping instead of sirens wailing. I found the house after months of searching online. It was in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes outside a smaller city. The houses all looked well-kept, practically in unison with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. But I'd heard from the realtor that the HOA here was involved. Normally, people say that like it's a selling point. Great community events, strict rules to keep property values high. That's the pitch. And naive me, I thought it sounded perfect. I pictured friendly neighbors barbecuing, potlucks on weekends, kids playing safely in the cul-de-sac. Exactly the antidote I needed after the chaos of city living. In my previous line of work, I was an insurance claims investigator. That probably sounds dull, but it required serious attention to detail. Sifting through documents, verifying statements, and noticing tiny discrepancies that could reveal fraud. After a decade of that, I have an eye for things that don't add up. I can't help it. It's like an involuntary reflex at this point. Something else you should know. I'm pretty frugal and extremely conscious of how I use resources. Call it a quirk or an obsession, but I hate wasting electricity. I unplug appliances I'm not using, replace all my light bulbs with LEDs, and basically live like I'm trying to sneak under some imaginary usage cap. Part of that is also environmental concern. Energy consumption is a big deal, right? So, every time I see my monthly bills, I comb through them, making sure the charges align with my actual usage. Another trait, which people either find endearing or annoying, is that I'm hyper-alert to any forms of petty authority or inconsistencies. It's left over from my days investigating all sorts of claims. If someone tries to push me around with questionable reasoning, I can't let it go. I have to see what's really going on. I met the HOA president, who I internally dubbed Karen, but eventually learned was actually named Carolyn, within days of moving in. She seemed to be waiting for me the moment the moving truck pulled away. She knocked on my door, wearing a floral blouse, khakis, and the broadest step-forward smile I'd ever seen. She handed me a welcome packet brimming with regulations about paint colors, acceptable mailbox shapes, yard decorations, how tall my fence could be. The list went on and on. First, I brushed it off. An overenthusiastic HOA president. Big whoop. But as we talked, actually, she did most of the talking. I noticed she had this habit of emphasizing rules. She'd say something like, "We must maintain uniform mailboxes," in a tone that suggested there was no room for discussion. She insisted the HOA was like a family, but I remember thinking, this is the type of family that dictates your bedtime and grounded you for not doing the dishes. Anyway, I chalked it up to typical suburban politics and tried not to overthink it. If only that had been the end of our interactions. I'd been in the house for a few months, and life was good. I liked waking up to birds instead of horns. My job had transitioned to more freelance investigative work, which allowed me to spend more time at home. But then, one morning, I opened my electric bill and nearly spat out my coffee. The charge was 3 times higher than my average monthly usage back in the city, and that was factoring in the fact that I now used less electricity due to my frugal habits. I went over every possible explanation in my head. Was it the change in climate? Air conditioning, maybe? But the bill arrived in early spring, when I wasn't even blasting heat or AC. I was basically wearing a hoodie indoors if it got chilly. No new major appliances, no space heaters, no big electronics. My gut told me something was off. Given my background, my first step was to call the power company. I calmly explained that my usage appeared inflated, triple what a single occupant with strict energy habits should consume. They scheduled a technician to come check the meter, suspecting it might be faulty or incorrectly reporting my consumption. A week later, the technician showed up. He ran some tests on my meter, replaced a couple of components, and used a handheld device to read the usage directly. Everything looked normal from his end. He scratched his head and shrugged. According to him, I was definitely pulling more power than the baseline for a single home. He politely suggested I might want to check my appliances or look for any hidden energy drains, even though I'd already done so. By this point, my mind was racing. I'd never had an issue like this, and the sudden jump in usage made no sense. My house is cozy and simple. I'm the furthest thing from a lavish spender on energy. So how could the bill be this high? I tried to shrug it off as some freak occurrence. Maybe it was a one-time anomaly. Yet, somewhere in the back of my mind, that investigator's instinct started picking at the problem. Something must be causing this, I thought. Maybe it's not even on my property. Maybe it's something external. Little did I know, that lingering thought would become the key to unraveling a bigger nightmare. It began innocently enough. A soft humming noise late at night, like a distant generator or large HVAC unit. I mostly heard it around midnight, though it came and went unpredictably. At first, I wrote it off as normal suburban background noise. Maybe a neighbor's heating system was old, or someone was using power tools in a garage. But the consistency of it, nearly the same time every night, made me curious. I started walking around my backyard, trying to locate the source. The faint buzz seemed to come from somewhere near the fence line, but with all the fences in this neighborhood, it was hard to pinpoint. A few days after I first noticed the humming, I began experiencing odd flickers in my own house lights, specifically around dawn. It was as if my home's entire electrical supply dimmed for a split second. When I compared notes with the hum, I realized they often coincided: late-night hum, then early morning flicker. If I'd been less paranoid, I might have thought it was just a power surge. But combined with my outrageous electric bill, I sensed a pattern. I started logging the times and durations of the flickers. I'm a sucker for data. If I could find a correlation, maybe I could show the power company some actual evidence of weird fluctuations. One frosty morning, I remember seeing the glimmer of ice on the grass. I wandered outside to check my fence. I had no real reason other than a hunch. That's when I noticed this peculiar patch of grass right along my fence line that wasn't frosted over. In fact, it felt almost warm to the touch, as if something below the surface was generating heat. Instantly, my investigative senses went on high alert. What could heat the soil in one small spot in near-freezing weather? An underground pipe? A short in the electrical line? My mind was buzzing with possibilities, and all of them seemed to tie back to some mystery related to my inflated electric usage. The best vantage point was also close to Carolyn's backyard. She lived 2 lots down, so her property's fence touched mine on a corner. My curiosity began steering me toward one suspect in particular, though I needed more to go on. People in the neighborhood sometimes referred to Carolyn as the gatekeeper. She was always around when a new rule was about to be enforced. She'd print out flyers and tuck them into door handles, or stand guard at the mailbox kiosk to hand out new guidelines. But lately, I'd noticed she was less confrontational and more nervous. She'd still do her routine checks, but there was an edge to her. She'd glance over at my fence sometimes, and if she spotted me working in my yard, she'd give this tight smile, then hurry back inside. I chalked it up to general nosiness until a couple of neighbors, the friendlier ones, mentioned that Carolyn had been receiving large deliveries at odd hours, boxes unloaded from unmarked vans. Another neighbor claimed to have seen men in plain clothes come by late at night, though no one seemed to know who they were. As I pieced things together, I recalled my warm patch of grass was near Carolyn's boundary. If there was some hidden cable or if she was running high-powered equipment, that might explain the electricity drain. But it felt like a stretch at first. After all, who steals power in a suburban neighborhood like some cartoon villain? Yet, the more I analyzed the bizarre flickering, the large deliveries, and Carolyn's edgy behavior, the more plausible it became. My suspicions grew that Carolyn's property, and possibly something behind her fence, was the source of whatever I was experiencing. I also remembered the small disputes I'd had with Carolyn since moving in. She'd fussed at me for painting my shutters a shade of gray that she insisted was not on the approved palette. Another time, she left a note on my mailbox. "Your mailbox is half an inch too high. Please adjust accordingly." That level of micromanaging rubbed me the wrong way, and I began to suspect that Carolyn's desire for control might extend beyond mailbox heights. Anyone that fixated on rules is often trying to ensure no one else stumbles onto their own secrets. That's a lesson I learned through my old job. The more someone tries to manage others, the more they might be concealing about themselves. With every piece of knowledge I gathered, my determination to investigate grew. I might be new to the neighborhood, but I wasn't going to let petty intimidation or odd stares scare me off. If Carolyn was messing with my electric line, or anything else unscrupulous, I would find out. My old insurance job taught me the basics of low-level surveillance. How to be unobtrusive and patient, how to dress in dark, non-reflective clothing, and how to keep track of details without giving yourself away. So, at midnight on a particularly moonless night, I suited up. Black hoodie, black pants, and a small notebook. I stepped quietly into my backyard, using the cover of darkness. I set up near the fence line, close to that warm patch of grass, where I could also hear the humming best. My heart was racing with adrenaline. I'd never done stakeouts for something like this. A neighborhood HOA dispute, but there I was, crouched behind a bush, waiting for any sign of movement. It didn't take long for the humming to start up again. Around 12:15 a.m., the same gentle buzz that seemed to come from the fence. Following the sound, I inched along the perimeter until I found one section of the fence that felt slightly looser than the rest. I pressed my ear against it. Sure enough, the hum was louder. Curiosity overcame me. I nudged the fence board, and it shifted, revealing a narrow gap. I peered through. My vision adjusted to the faint light on the other side, and I nearly gasped. I saw a large greenhouse, one that wasn't visible from the street. It was faintly lit with a greenish glow, like those colored bulbs people sometimes use for special plants. But this was bigger and more involved than any backyard greenhouse I'd ever seen. Moving the fence board a bit more, I could see thick black cables running from the greenhouse, buried into the ground near the property line. My side of the property was maybe 6 feet away, but everything was dark. It appeared the cables extended under the fence and potentially toward my electrical supply. My stomach churned. Could I have just stumbled on an illegal power hookup? If so, that might be exactly why my bills were so high. Someone else was siphoning my electricity. But I needed more concrete proof. Leaning in too close risk detection, so I memorized what I saw. The greenhouse, thick cables, that haunting green glow, and the faint hum. Then I backed away, quietly returning to my house with my heart pounding. I knew I had to confirm this in the light of day, if possible. Early the next morning, I headed straight to my utility box on the side of the house. I'd looked at it before, but never in the context of searching for tampering. Now I examined every surface, screw, and wire. To my shock, I noticed fresh scratches near the panel's edge, like someone had forced it open. I unscrewed the cover, and sure enough, there was a spliced line that definitely didn't look standard. A second cable had been expertly connected to the main feed and then snaked underground, leading right toward the fence. This was no small-time patch job. Whoever did it had some serious know-how. The connections were sealed and shielded enough to avoid casual detection or immediate suspicion. I felt a wave of mixed emotions. Relief at finally understanding why my bill was sky-high, and outrage at the brazen theft. And the fact that I recognized the greenhouse from the night before meant I had a prime suspect. Carolyn. All the puzzle pieces fell into place. The humming at night was from that massive greenhouse operation, which must be drawing a staggering amount of electricity. That would neatly explain the flickering lights and the unusual power readings on my account. My warm patch of grass? Likely from the heat generated by the cables or some aspect of the greenhouse's equipment. It all came down to one horrifying reality. Carolyn was stealing my power to run whatever she was growing. I stood there for a moment trying to collect myself. Was I honestly dealing with a neighbor who'd orchestrated an elaborate power heist? In a quiet suburban neighborhood? My anger burned. A part of me wanted to storm over to Carolyn's and confront her. But my more rational side, shaped by years of investigating insurance fraud, knew I needed undeniable evidence if I wanted to make sure she faced consequences. Plus, there was always the possibility that something even bigger was at stake. I decided to keep calm, gather proof, and then figure out the safest way to proceed. Because if she had the guts to tap into someone's electrical main, who knew what else she was capable of? The very next night, I took my plan a step further. I set up a small digital camera and audio recorder, lightweight devices I'd used during my insurance claims days. My goal was simple: photograph and film the greenhouse, the cables, and anything else I could observe. I wasn't sure if I'd see Carolyn in action, but any footage of the setup itself would be a gold mine. I dressed in black again, slipped into the backyard, and eased my way along the fence line. My heart hammered in my chest, but I tried to remain focused on the task. The night air was cold, and I felt it cling to my skin, adding to the tension. I found the same loose board and pressed my camera lens to the gap. Immediately, I saw that same faint green glow. Several enormous grow lights illuminated rows of plants, too many for a casual gardener. Then I spotted the industrial fans, large chemical containers, and rows of pipes and tubing that looked a lot like a hydroponic system. This was a heavy-duty setup, professional, even. I started filming, zooming in on details, the cables running to the greenhouse, the large fans attached to vents in the glass. Occasionally, I heard a low whooshing sound from inside, like a big ventilation system kicking on. Carolyn came into view briefly, wearing gloves and meticulously adjusting something on a row of plants. I snapped a few photos for good measure. When I zoomed in further, I spotted containers labeled with chemical names that I didn't recognize off the top of my head. If this were just a greenhouse for tomatoes or orchids, the scale wouldn't be so grandiose. Given the secrecy and the amount of power being siphoned, I started to suspect she might be cultivating something illegal, maybe a high-value narcotic or experimental plants. The presence of so many fans and special lights reeked of an operation that didn't want prying eyes or noses to catch on. I felt a sudden jolt of panic. If this was indeed illegal, then I was potentially dealing with criminals, not just some controlling HOA fanatic. The risk was real. If Carolyn discovered me snooping, what would she or her associates do? I decided I had enough footage for one night. I quietly slipped back inside, adrenaline still coursing through me, determined to get a plan in place. My next move was to bring someone else into the loop. I chose Charles, a neighbor 3 doors down whom I'd grown to trust. We bonded over some shared interests and had chatted about how overbearing Carolyn could be. Charles was a semi-retired accountant with a no-nonsense attitude and a knack for deciphering complicated financial statements. More importantly, he was level-headed and discreet. I showed him the photos and some of the footage, skipping the more incriminating angles that could immediately identify me if they fell into the wrong hands. Charles's eyes widened. He let out a low whistle and said, "I always knew Carolyn had some shady side hustle, but this is next level." He suggested a 2-pronged approach. 1. File an anonymous tip with the power company's fraud department. Utility companies lose a lot of money to illegal hookups, so they tend to act quickly if there's evidence. 2. Quietly share the footage with a few reliable neighbors who weren't in Carolyn's pocket. If more people knew about it, it would be harder for her to cover it up if confronted. We also talked about how to keep me safe. Charles pointed out that if Carolyn was running an illicit operation, she might have allies or investors who wouldn't hesitate to threaten me, or worse, to keep me quiet. The more people who secretly had copies of my evidence, the harder it would be for Carolyn to make it disappear. Charles offered to store a backup of my files on an encrypted USB drive in his safe. I agreed, feeling a little less alone in this bizarre suburban conspiracy. The following day, I called the utility provider's fraud hotline from a burner phone. Yes, that might sound paranoid, but you have to remember my investigative background. I explained that there was reason to believe my neighbor was tapping into my power line to run a large-scale grow operation. I provided the address, but I didn't give any personal details. They seemed intrigued, saying they'd send a specialized team to investigate. They asked a few follow-up questions, like the location of the splice connection, and I tried to give them enough info without revealing who I was. Over the next few days, Charles and I carefully reached out to two other neighbors we trusted. An older couple who'd lived there for years and were wary of Carolyn's meddling, and a younger woman who had recently moved in after divorcing her spouse. They seemed shocked but not entirely surprised that Carolyn might be involved in something shady. We shared blurred clips from the greenhouse footage, enough to spark their concern but not so much that our vantage point was obvious. Quietly, word began to spread, and you could sense a shift in the neighborhood. People who'd once been politely distant started giving Carolyn's house guarded looks. Carolyn appeared more anxious with each passing day. She'd still do her rounds, but there was a tension in how she moved, like she was waiting for something bad to drop. I also noticed an increase in mysterious traffic around her property. Unmarked vans in the early morning, the occasional black sedan idling at the curb. My gut told me these visitors might be linked to her operation, possibly checking on security or discussing contingency plans. The air felt charged, like a storm was about to break. A week or so later, two utility technicians showed up in a marked truck, accompanied by what looked like private security or maybe law enforcement in plain clothes. They parked near my home and began setting up monitoring equipment around the property lines. I stayed inside, peering through the blinds, relieved that someone with authority was finally stepping in. Other neighbors craned their necks from their windows, curious about the commotion. The technicians first inspected my side, confirming that the lines were spliced. Then they moved on to Carolyn's property, presumably with some warrant or at least a legal reason to check. Carolyn came outside, greeting them with a facade of calm. She stood with her arms folded, occasionally glancing at the onlookers. Even from my window, I could sense her forced smile. She laughed a little too loudly at something the technician said, likely trying to project confidence. But her body language gave her away. Tense shoulders, twitchy hands, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Midway through the inspection, a black SUV with heavily tinted windows rolled up. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out. He spoke to Carolyn in hushed tones, gesturing at the technicians with a stern expression. Carolyn nodded rapidly, her face draining of color. Then the man got back in the SUV and drove off, leaving the rest of us to wonder who he was. My mind raced with questions. Was he a lawyer, some kind of investor, or even an enforcer? As the inspection continued, I stepped out onto my porch, pretending to water some potted plants so I could listen in. I caught snippets of conversation. Words like deadlines, funding, and shipment floated through the air. One of the technicians looked visibly uncomfortable. It was as if they'd stumbled onto something bigger than a standard electricity theft. Suddenly, Bradley, one of the more influential HOA board members, appeared, walking briskly up Carolyn's driveway. He carried a duffel bag. He held it out to Carolyn without so much as looking around. Then he hurried away, avoiding eye contact with neighbors. The casual hush-hush handoff made my skin crawl. Felt like I was witnessing a scene from a crime movie. Watching this unfold, I realized we might be dealing with a whole network. Carolyn wasn't just a controlling HOA president who wanted to keep my mailbox standard. She had connections to multiple people in the community, possibly city officials too, who were helping her run or protect a far larger operation. I felt my stomach knot up. Reporting this was already dangerous, but if more people in positions of power were involved, the stakes were sky high. I decided to take one more risk, hoping to capture audio of any hush-hush discussions. My plan was to hide a small voice recorder near Carolyn's greenhouse. If I could catch mention of a shipment or the involvement of local officials, that might be the evidence law enforcement needed to go after the entire operation, not just Carolyn. On the third night of my stakeouts, I noticed Carolyn had installed additional security. New cameras perched on her roof, motion sensor lights, maybe even sensors along the fence line. She was clearly spooked and expecting trouble. Nonetheless, I decided to press on. Perhaps foolishly, because part of me felt I couldn't let this slip away. Everything was going fine until I stepped on a small piece of loose gravel near the side of her house. The crunch echoed in the stillness. Within seconds, floodlights blazed on. I dove behind a row of bushes, my heart pounding like a jackhammer. Carolyn and another figure, possibly Bradley, sprinted out the back door. They had flashlights in hand, swinging the beams across the yard. I held my breath, crouched painfully low. For a moment, the flashlight beams swept right over the bush I was hiding behind. In that second, I was sure they'd see me. My mind raced with how to explain myself if caught. But somehow, either luck or darkness saved me. They muttered to each other. Something about, "Who's out here?" And I swear I heard something. Eventually, they retreated inside, but not before Carolyn spent another minute or so sweeping the lights across the fence line. I decided that night to slink back to my home and wait it out. But luck wasn't entirely on my side. Early the next morning, as I stepped into my backyard, I found Carolyn standing near my fence. She was waiting for me. The moment she locked eyes with me, she marched over, her face contorted with anger. "What are you doing lurking around my property at night?" she snapped. There was no friendly, neighborly pretense anymore. Gone was the polite but condescending smile. She was raw, furious, and not bothering to hide it. I let my frustration boil over. I told her I knew she was siphoning my electricity, that I'd seen the greenhouse, and that I had proof of the illegal hookup. She didn't deny it. Instead, her eyes narrowed with cold fury. She took a step closer. "So you think you can just expose me?" she spat. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Her words sent a chill through me. She basically confirmed that I was dealing with more than just a suburban power thief. She hinted at powerful backers, bigger interests, people who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their operation. "You'd better stop poking around," Carolyn warned, "or you'll end up regretting it." I felt a flicker of fear but also a surge of defiance. If her operation was that large, it needed to be stopped. But she clearly wasn't going to back down without a fight, and I suspected she'd try to make good on her threat if cornered. To my complete shock, Carolyn suddenly changed tactics. Her gaze flicked around to see if anyone was watching, and then she said, "Come with me. I'll show you exactly what you're dealing with." Against my better judgment, I followed her inside her fence line, perhaps out of a morbid curiosity or because I sensed she wasn't planning immediate violence in broad daylight. She led me through a gate and into the massive greenhouse I'd only glimpsed before. The moment we stepped inside, my jaw dropped. Rows upon rows of hydroponic tanks, each with robust plants under industrial grow lights. The smell was pungent, a mix of chemicals and plant matter. Large ventilation systems hummed overhead, and the temperature was controlled by multiple fans and humidifiers. It looked more like a clandestine research lab than a gardener's hobby. There were racks of containers labeled with chemical formulas, an entire row of carefully arranged seedlings, and high-powered LED arrays that cost a fortune to run 24/7. This was a serious operation, the kind that would require an enormous amount of capital and specialized knowledge. Carolyn walked me through, her voice eerily calm. "This isn't just about making money," she said. "It's about influence, controlling the HOA, the local zoning board, even municipal decisions. People will do anything if you hold the right leverage." From the way she talked, it sounded like she was just one cog in a much bigger machine. Perhaps the chemicals and plants were part of a pipeline that extended beyond our sleepy suburb. She mentioned strategic alliances, long-term city expansions, and environmental grants that could be manipulated. My head spun. This was no petty scheme. It was the stuff of high-level corruption, with Carolyn as a local enforcer. By the time we left the greenhouse, I was both terrified and strangely resolute. She'd shown me the scale of her operation, maybe to intimidate me, maybe to recruit me, but I left with the firm understanding that exposing her meant drawing the wrath of a powerful network. Yet, letting it continue would let them siphon resources and strong-arm the community indefinitely. We stepped back into the cool morning air, and Carolyn locked the greenhouse behind her. She fixed me with a look that was a bizarre blend of pity and superiority. "You see the extent of what's at play here," she said. "This is bigger than a single greenhouse or a single HOA. We have city officials, maybe even state-level interests invested in this. If you go public, you'll be stepping on a hornet's nest." She then laid it out plainly. "Stay silent if you value your life. If you keep pushing, there are people who won't hesitate to make you disappear. Her voice had a chilling neutrality, the kind that made me believe she wasn't bluffing. My throat felt dry, but I managed to speak. I can't let you drain the entire neighborhood. Drain me. To fund whatever this is. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she offered one last parting shot. Then you've made your choice. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. She turned and walked off, leaving me to grapple with the enormity of what I just witnessed. Terrified but resolute, I turned to a former colleague, Mia, who now worked at a local newspaper. Mia was an investigative journalist who owed me a favor from our days unraveling a complicated insurance fraud ring. I reached out discreetly, showing her the splice line footage, greenhouse photos, and even some suspicious HOA financial records that Charles and I had managed to obtain. He'd noticed large sums going in and out of the HOA's accounts without clear explanation. Mia was stunned. She promised to pass the details to a detective she trusted. Someone she described as incorruptible and annoyingly persistent. That sounded perfect to me. The last thing I wanted was to hand over evidence to a local official who might be in Carolyn's pocket. Within a week, that detective contacted me. She asked for more information but stressed absolute secrecy, suspecting local authorities might be compromised. We arranged a low-key meeting at a diner a few towns away. I handed over digital copies of everything. The videos, the photos, my logs of flickering lights, and even a statement describing how I found the spliced cable. The detective listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and assured me they would proceed methodically to build a case big enough that it couldn't just be swept under the rug. Apparently, the detective worked with a specialized task force that handled organized crime and large-scale fraud. After analyzing my files and doing some covert surveillance of their own, they coordinated a sting. Late one afternoon, law enforcement vehicles, some marked, some unmarked, rolled into our cul-de-sac. I was peeking from behind my curtains again, heart pounding with a mix of fear and relief. They approached Carolyn's house with a warrant in hand. She tried to act nonchalant, but within minutes, they discovered the cables, the chemicals, and the entire greenhouse setup. Neighbors began stepping out onto their porches, some filming on their phones, as officers hauled out boxes of evidence. It was surreal, like a scene from a TV show, but it was happening on our sleepy suburban street. As the sun began to set, Carolyn was led out in handcuffs. Her face was a mask of controlled fury, a single moment of eye contact with me revealing she was already thinking about how to salvage her position or take revenge. Bradley, the board member who'd given her the duffel bag, vanished the moment the police arrived. Later, I heard he resigned from the HOA board and left town, presumably trying to dodge the fallout. Another board member also stepped down abruptly after the raid. It seemed they realized their cozy arrangement had come crashing down. With Carolyn gone, the HOA was in disarray. The rest of the board members called an emergency meeting to figure out next steps. Charles attended and reported that the HOA would be temporarily dissolved while an external audit took place. Neighbors cheered at the news of a cleanup, hoping it would usher in an era of transparency and trust. A few people, including Charles, volunteered to spearhead a new, reformed HOA structure if the community decided it was still needed. Their main objective? Ensuring that no single individual could ever seize that much control again. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, but not without some lingering apprehension. Carolyn's calm composure during her arrest suggested she believed her powerful backers might still protect her. And sure enough, over the following weeks, I noticed the occasional black SUV or tinted sedan driving slowly down our street, as if scoping out who was still around and who might be a loose end. Most residents tried to move on. They planted gardens, repainted fences that had fallen into disrepair, and even talked about organizing the first real block party in years. But underneath the surface, there was a quiet concern that the larger network might retaliate or regroup. Carolyn's parting words echoed in my head. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. As for me, I decided to stay. Moving away felt like letting them win, like I'd be running scared for the rest of my life. Besides, I have friends here now, Charles and others who stood by me. My electric bill finally returned to normal, and the sense of violation I felt each time I paid triple my usage began to fade.